If you look at a map of Melbourne's railway network, there's one part that really stands out. At the centre of the map, all of the lines swirl together into a big circular loop. Or as Jay Foreman put it in their video about the tube map, no line manages to cross to the other side of the city without being spun around in the whirlpool in the centre. This so-called whirlpool is Melbourne's City Loop Railway, and it forms the heart of the city's rail network, with basically every suburban rail line in the city being funneled into it. The City Loop is comprised of 5 stations that circle around the Melbourne Central Business District or CBD. 2 of these stations are above ground, those being Flinders Street station on the city's southern edge and Southern Cross station on its western edge. These stations are connected by a 6-track set of viaducts and have been around in some form for over 100 years. The remaining 3 stations are much newer, all having opened in the 1980s and were built below ground. They are Melbourne Central and Flagstaff on the city's north, with Paliament to the city's east, and these stations are linked by 4 pairs of tunnel tracks. The layout of the loop means that a train coming in from the suburbs is able to do a loop through these 5 stations before heading back the way it came. And this is how the majority of Melbourne suburban train lines operate. There is even a weird quirk where some of the loop lines switch direction in the middle of the day to accommodate the different demands of the morning and afternoon peaks, which can make navigating the loop a bit confusing for the uninitiated and does lead to odd gaps in the schedule when trains are switching direction. But the title of this video, at least when I'm recording this, I might change my mind on it later, is about the plans to fix the loop. And you usually only try to fix something when it's broken. So besides the weird direction switching, is the loop actually causing problems? Well, while it might have seemed like a good idea when it was built, these days the loop acts as a significant constraint on the potential usefulness of Melbourne's rail network. And there have already been billions of dollars poured into fixing it. The Metro Tunnel project, for example, which is set to potentially open as soon as later this year, is estimated to cost a total of $12 billion. And one of its key objectives is to reduce the pressure on the City Loop by taking the Pakenham, Cranbourne and Sunbury lines out of the loop and instead letting them run through the city centre via new underground tunnels and stations. I have a whole video dedicated to the Metro Tunnel topic if you want to know more. But while it might be the most progressed, it isn't the only project. There's also the City Loop reconfiguration project. And although it is much smaller in scope and likely a lot less costly than the Metro Tunnel, it has the potential to be just as impactful. Much like the Metro Tunnel project, the City Loop reconfiguration aims to take various train lines that currently run around the City Loop and connect them to allow through running across the CBD instead. But unlike the Metro Tunnel, this won't involve the construction of large sections of new underground track and whole new stations. Instead, it mostly makes use of the existing City Loop infrastructure and just adds 2 small new connections, those being from the loop tunnels to the west of Flagstaff to North Melbourne Station, and from the loop tunnels south of Paliament to Richmond Station. This will only require about 3 kilometres of new tunnel to be built, and would be expected to cost just $2 billion, so a fraction of the cost of the Metro Tunnel project. That said, just by building these 2 connections, Melbourne could massively boost its CBD rail capacity, potentially unlocking the ability to run an extra 20 trains per hour in each direction through the CBD, which, as the Rail Futures Institute put it, is the equivalent capacity of a 10-lane freeway. Which seems like a pretty good deal for $2 billion to me. By building these connections, the project will take 2 out of the current 4 City Loop tracks and split them in half, creating a northern section connecting North Melbourne directly to Richmond via Flagstaff, Melbourne Central and Paliament, as well as a southern section also connecting North Melbourne and Richmond, but this time via Southern Cross and Flinders Street, effectively turning what was 2 tracks worth of capacity into 4. But what will this mean for Melbourne's rail network? Well, we first need to account for the changes being brought in by the Metro Tunnel, which upon its opening will see the Pakenham and Cranbourne lines through running up to Sunbury, letting the Frankston line take its space in the loop, then taking the Frankston line space on the existing through-running tracks to Werribee and Williamstown will be the Sandringham line. Now when you add the future City Loop reconfiguration changes on top of that, even more lines will be switched to through-running. These are only draft plans and there is potential for them to change, but in Infrastructure Victoria's proposal, the Frankston line, whose time running in the loop will be short-lived, will be connected up with the Craigieburn line via 2 tracks opened up in the northern section. Then, using the southern section will be the Glen Waverley and Upfield lines. There is also potential for the Paliament line to join them, although that would likely require extra tracks to be built from Burnley to Camberwell so as not to impact the capacity of the Lilydale and Belgrave lines. Speaking of the Lilydale and Belgrave lines, they, alongside the Hurstbridge and Mernda lines, will be the only ones remaining that circle all 5 loop stations. So, if we compare that with what Melbourne has today, you're going to go from just one set of lines providing cross-city service to 4 sets with the Metro Tunnel and the loop reconfiguration. That's not even including a future Metro Tunnel 2 project, although that's a topic for another video. But these changes do hit at the heart of one of the biggest issues with the City Loop, that it's basically just a fancy way of having trains terminate in the CBD, and has limited the potential for cross-city travel. When the loop was originally built, the government's view of the rail network was basically just as a tool for bringing 9 to 5 workers into and out of the CBD. Even before the loop's construction, the options for cross-city travel were pretty limited, with trains coming in from the east, for example, often just terminating at Flinders Street without going on to Southern Cross. Those terminating trains would then shunt back out of Flinders Street to be stabled at the nearby Jolimont rail yards, to wait for evening peak, where they would then head around the loop again, picking up passengers to take them back to their homes in the suburbs. At the time, the City Loop was seen as improving this, because instead of having to reverse the trains along the busy tracks filled with oncoming trains to get to Jolimont Yards, the loop would allow the train to continue in a circle and bypass this traffic. It would also have the benefit of reducing pressure on Flinders Street Station, by dispersing the CBD-bound passengers across 5 stations instead of just the existing 2. While this solved one problem, it introduced another. That is, by the time the train had gotten to the final stations in the loop of the CBD, it was basically empty, as it wasn't going anywhere except a rail yard, which many view as a pretty big waste of capacity in what is the most critical part of the city's rail network. This would be less of the case after the loop reconfiguration, as you'd be having people potentially using the line to travel to stops past the other side of the CBD. Now, these days we tend to view our rail networks as more than just 9 to 5 commuter services, and see their value in helping people make trips that aren't necessarily between the CBD and the suburbs. Because of this, we're now running more services during the off-peak, although there is still a lot of room for improvement. Jolimont Yards has also been removed, and we now typically stable trains further out from the city. So that easy stabling benefit of why the loop was built has kind of been lost. However, there was more to the loop than just that. It was also an opportunity to develop the northern sections of Melbourne CBD, and in this sense it was successful. When Melbourne was only served by Flinders Street and Southern Cross Station, called Spencer Street at the time, passengers travelling to the northeast of the CBD would either need to take a long walk or change for a tram. This limited access to this part of the city, and as a result limited development. But the new loop stations changed that, giving these areas direct rail access. This direct access is something that would, however, be lost for many commuters as part of the City Loop reconfiguration. As somebody travelling on the Craigieburn line, for example, who wanted to get somewhere near Flinders Street Station, would now need to change trains at North Melbourne, where previously they would have had a direct train. That said, basically all of the world's great metro systems require a large portion of their users to change trains. So if Melbourne wants to grow its network, this is something that will just need to be accepted. Though even today the City Loop still requires interchanges. For example, many services just terminate at Flinders Street and Southern Cross, and passengers wanting to travel to the city beyond those stations already need to change trains. As do of course almost all passengers looking to travel across the CBD to stations on the other side of the city, some of whom will now actually have direct trains as part of the reconfiguration. These new requirements for passengers to interchange will however put a lot more pressure on North Melbourne and Richmond stations, and work will probably be needed to ensure they have sufficient capacity and that their interchanges are actually convenient. But is there any plan to actually get this work started? Well, there are no defined dates at the moment. A report released by PTV from 2012 suggested it should be started by at least 2032, and while the project does continue to get mentioned in plans for the future of Melbourne's railways, we still don't have a concrete start date. In 2021, Infrastructure Victoria called for work on it to begin as soon as construction on the Metro Tunnel is completed, and that's coming up soon. So, in my view, the Victorian government should be getting preparations well underway. While the project won't be without some inconveniences, I think its benefits clearly outweigh its costs. It's very rare cities have the opportunity to gain so much rail capacity for such a low price tag. For less than 20% of the cost of the Metro Tunnel project, Melbourne could add almost as much capacity, all while unlocking better opportunities for cross-city travel. To me, this project is an absolute no-brainer, and the only surprising thing about it is that it hasn't happened sooner. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, consider giving it a like and subscribing if you haven't already. Also, if you have any thoughts on the City Loop reconfiguration project, like do you think it's worth doing, leave a comment below. And, as always, I'm City Moose. Thanks for watching.